Hey, friends, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. Today's guest is an executive director of Biblical Counselling UK and a pastor at Christ Church, Cambridge. He's known for his work in the areas of trauma, mental health, and the church. I'm grateful to spend time and have this conversation with Dr. Steve Midgley. Well, welcome to another episode of the Upside Down People podcast. I'm joined here with Steve Midgley, Dr. Steve Midgley, who is the Executive Director of Biblical Counselling in the UK and a pastor of Christ Church, Cambridge. I believe, Steve, as well, you are a trained psychiatrist. Is that correct?
Well, it's all a long time ago now. I've been in pastoral ministry for over 30 years. So my time in psychiatry was a long time ago, and I never climbed my way to the very top of the medical profession in any sense. So I was never working as a consultant, but I trained for a number of years in psychiatry. So yes, that was my background as a doctor and as working in psychiatry.
Okay. Awesome. And sort of what led you to shift to what you're currently doing now?
What led me to shift into psychiatry, from psychiatry into pastoral ministry? It was a slow process. I became a Christian in my first year as a medical student, which wasn't what I was anticipating, and God took hold of my life at that point. So I continued on, qualified as a doctor, initially working in sort of general practice, family medicine, and then moved on into psychiatry. I suppose there were maybe there were two things operating. The first was that I was taking on increasing amounts of opportunities in ministry, working on youth camps, helping to lead a church plant, and it was great joy to do that. And the sort of the feedback I was getting was that in that area of ministry, people were appreciating what I was able to use, the gifts that God had given me. So that was a sort of pull towards ministry in that kind of way. I guess the other was a sense that as I moved sort of through general practice into psychiatry, increasingly confronted by the really hard things that people faced in their lives, both in terms of sickness and in terms of mental health struggles, and kind of knowing that what we had to offer within medicine and psychiatry was limited.
Right.
It was good, and I appreciated it. I was really enjoying learning and training in that area. But I kind of thought the ability to be able to communicate the still greater hope that the gospel provided seemed to me a very precious thing to be able to do. And if I was going to have an opportunity to do that, then that's what I wanted.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm curious, just before we dive into the meat of the conversation, because you've done a lot of thinking around trauma and mental health and the church, and yeah, just diving into some of your thoughts from you recently wrote a book called Understanding Trauma as well, but just touching on how you came to salvation in your early university days. What did that look like, and what was that like for you?
Um, I could give you the long version or the short version. I'll try and do something in between. I kind of I'd never previously met people who engaged with church in a way that was kind of the whole of life. So we're talking about the where are we? The early 80s, and you know, I'd met people who were churchgoers and had this kind of religious bit. At university, I met people whose commitment to Christ was comprehensive, and I'd never met people like that before, and I just thought they were weird. Um, and
Hmm.
in the 80s, we weren't particularly postmodern. So we weren't particularly saying to one another, well, that's lovely for you, I've got something else, and so on. It was much more kind of, you think that this is true, I don't think this is true, so we would argue.
Right.
And so I did a lot of arguing over a number of months, uh, trying to sort of expose what I thought was the ridiculousness of the Christian faith.
Hmm.
Um, and probably the biggest impact was um, pitching up at a group um, that looked at Mark's account of the life of Jesus, and reading that through with them. And constantly I was picking holes in it and thinking, this is ridiculous. But I think
Right.
at the same time, God was confronting me with the person of Jesus. And ultimately, when
Brilliant.
the moment came, and a good friend, who remains a very close friend, put me on the spot and said, do you want to become a Christian? And in some
Hmm.
ways, when I got to that stage, I wanted to say, I think I probably already am, because I'd sort of felt as though I kind of ran out of
Right.
arguments, and I didn't, and I preferred their arguments to my arguments. Sort of, that this was, I'm sort of condensing many months. But as he said, do you want to become a Christian? It was clear to me that I hadn't made a decision of the will, and that still needed to be done. And at that stage, I felt very scared. That was the predominant emotion. I knew that this was a big thing that I was
What
thinking about doing.
what were you able to pinpoint that fear, or what was the root of
It,
that?
I think it was I think it was to a large extent the fear of the unknown.
Okay.
I knew that what was involved. I'd come to. I mean, there's so much I didn't understand about the Christian faith at that point. I guess,
Hmm.
like lots of people, when they become Christians. But I understood enough to know that this was committing myself, to follow Christ, and that was a comprehensive commitment. And it felt like losing control. It felt like kind of, I mean, I remember this sort of, it felt as I was on the edge of a precipice and I was going to step and I didn't know what was the far side. It was sort of, it really was that kind of feeling. And, at that stage, what I remember thinking was, nobody I have ever encountered, seems more trustworthy than this Jesus.
Wow.
And if I can't trust him, I can't trust anybody.
Wow.
What I'd read about him, I was just sort of, I had increasingly become, sort of, um, uh, just deeply, deeply impressed, by the character of the person that walked off the pages of the gospel. And so it was, if I can't trust him, I can't trust anyone, and that was how I made the decision. And it was very funny,
Yeah. Awesome.
Caleb, because my friend was then very, very excited. He thought
Yeah.
this was absolutely marvelous, and I was trying to calm him down, but, and say, no, it's not that big. Of course, he knew that it was,
Right.
and I didn't. So that was one of my memories of that night.
Oh, that's brilliant. That must have been a real precious moment for you both, but also particularly for a friend that's been journeying through all the questioning, the doubts, the picking holes at things, and then also just coming to understand and trust in the words of Jesus. It almost reminds me of what C.S. Lewis says, like you have to make a decision of whether this Jesus is a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. Is he who he says he is? And it's trusting in that. So I love that story, and I also particularly love as well, like you said before, the postmodern critiques where each person has their own sense of direction and fulfillment, and you sort of on your own journeys. I think the disruption with that is it doesn't allow for that robust conversation, that robust engagement in opposing views or differing views. So I like that it seemed like there's this space that was created where you could enter into as a non-Christian and just really just look at the Bible and not take offense, but if you had offense, be able to question why that is, and same with your friends as well. They could engage in that space where I think particularly here in Australia, I know in other Western parts that we've really lost that. Um, and I think that's something that like I would love to see more people engaging in is just that honest conversation and honest open dialogue in like really trying to find what is the truth, what are we trying to look for. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Caleb. And one of my reflections in my time as a pastor is that we I sometimes worry that we don't do that very well in church.
yeah.
That kind of as it were, once a person has sort of in whatever way crossed the threshold and they're identifying as a Christian, um, we don't make it very easy to go on having questions and puzzles. We kind of expect you to buy into
Yeah.
everything. Um, and I think people do that, but they haven't really puzzled through some of their questions.
Mm,
And I think sometimes that comes back to bite us
yeah.
because when difficulties come into our life, particularly when suffering comes, if we haven't really wrestled with our questions and sort of, as it were, it kind of really tested out the faith and thought through some of the things that we find difficult, then I think we're quite vulnerable.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, thinking through our doubts. I think who was it? Was it I can't remember whether it was Don Carson or Tim Keller uses the analogy of saying that our doubts are a bit like our antibodies.
Mm,
That
yeah.
they having sort of wrestled with our doubts, it's like we've got antibodies in our system.
That's
So
great.
when trouble comes, we're ready to respond. If
Yeah.
we've never done that, then it can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um, and,
And
I, and
that
I think and I think in churches we're often just not good enough about saying it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to sort of find this part of the Christian faith difficult
yeah.
in our small groups. Ask. Let's talk these things through.
Yeah, I think you're 100% on the money there. I think it's something that we can definitely work towards creating a culture and a space where people can come with questions. Because I think that's the thing is when you become a Christian, it doesn't mean all your questions are answered. Often that's just like the starting point. You have lots of questions beforehand, but then you become a Christian, and it's like, wow, there's so many more questions. And I love that an analogy of the antibodies because it says something about exposure as well. Like you have to be exposed to pain and suffering to develop these this understanding of how do you have a biblical perspective of journeying through it, what's a healthy way of dealing with it, and how do you take questions or doubts or anxieties or just these different things and yeah, wrestle with it and wrestle with God with it. And I think I'm sure we'll get into it in the conversation as well, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the church can engage in that space well with people journeying through suffering or trauma. So yeah, when it comes to trauma, I suppose when you talk about it, what exactly are we talking about? How do you define it, or how do you frame it in a contemporary perspective?
Yeah, the answer to that question is not as straightforward as you might think, because um, there isn't one settled definition of trauma,
Right.
and the term is used by different people in different ways, and that makes it slightly complicated. Um, One important difference, I think, is, and some people who write in the field distinguish between what they call big T trauma and little T trauma.
Okay.
And the distinction they're making there is sort of big T trauma is some of the most severe sufferings. So the sort of thing that um, somebody on the battlefield, military personnel might experience in the horrors of war,
Mm.
or appalling abuse that a child might endure through extended childhood abuse, um, some awful natural disaster, the utterly out of the ordinary suffering that someone might experience. Um, Whereas little t trauma um, would include um, bereavement, long period of illness, um, eh, sort of still things that matter and are hard. Um, but actually, when you when you take a survey of people, you end up finding that probably 70% of us have experienced one of those little t traumas. And when you once you do that, then you end up sort of saying, well, then trauma now starts to become kind of an ordinary part of life. The majority of us have experienced it, um, and so I think most of the most of the most of the sort of academic writing that has been done has tended to focus on the big T trauma,
Okay.
on the outside the normal range, an experience in which there is a degree of helplessness. That seems to be a particular feature that people identify where you're not able to do anything to protect yourself, or to escape from this awful experience that is happening to you. Um, and it other writers um, talk in terms of three E's: an event, something that happens, or a sequence of events, um, the experience of the event, how we kind of experience it, the impact it has upon us, and then the ongoing effect.
Mm.
So when we're thinking about trauma, we're thinking about something that has happened that we've experienced in such a way that it has ongoing impacts in our lives.
Right. And so, I mean, I suppose one question that I do have off that is like, obviously, big T trauma is very easy to understand from a outside perspective, or acknowledge, or sort of, yeah, just give a platform for. And little T trauma seems more nuanced and more difficult for people who aren't necessarily going through it to be able to understand or give it value or credit. Is that something that you notice within culture or within the church, or is it something that people people are sort of identifying with their trauma?
Um, I slightly lost you connection in the middle of that, but
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. I think that I mean, in some ways, the the lesser the lesser forms of, well, that's a terrible way of putting it, isn't it? But um, um, things that the more sort of common experiences of suffering that we have allow us to connect because, in some sense, they're familiar to us. They're not outside our range of normal experience. I think it's where somebody has faced something that feels very um, alien and unfamiliar to us, that we can tend to retreat.
Right.
We can feel like, oh, this is, I don't know what to say. I feel, sort of frightened. I'm going to say the wrong thing. This is so outside my range of experience. Um, and, and so we sort of, we pull back. Um, and I think, you talk to people who have faced really severe, trauma, which has an ongoing impact in their life. And I think one of, one of the things that they will describe to you is the sense of isolation, the
Mm.
sense of kind of distance they feel, and even a measure of shame that they are left with.
Right.
because somehow um, they feel as though others are treating them differently,
Right.
and are not able to respond to them. And I think that's one of the things I was trying to achieve by writing this book, was to say, how can churches um, um, include and involve and engage with the people within our communities, and the people who might enter into our communities, for whom this has been part of their experience.
Right. And just off of that, what are some, like, some ways or some spaces or different cultures we can begin to think about and create as Christians, but then also as churches, to yeah, engage with this topic of trauma, with this experience that people within our communities are walking through trauma that is isolating them from community, yet we know community is so important. So what's some space, what's ways churches can engage with trauma and people's experiences of trauma?
Um, that to some extent, to educate ourselves would be a first step. Trauma's been described as the word of the decade. The 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 sort of the cultural interest in trauma and trauma studies is huge at the moment. I think I'm probably saying what is obvious to all of us. It's a very, it's a very prominent issue that gets mentioned lots in the media, um, and simply simply becoming a little bit more familiar with some of the writing and thinking about what the trauma experience is, um, how it, how our secular world is trying to understand it, um, is kind of a sort of a basic first step. We're not trying to become experts. We're not, we're not sort of needing to get into the cutting edge of things, but just enough so that the the language of trauma, um, the things that people would say about their experiences, is not completely alien to us, and we don't just retreat. Um, and then I think, you know to be respectfully interested, if I can put it like that. If we find ourselves in conversation with somebody, and in some way they begin to mention something that has been part of their life and their experience, and it becomes clear that it is either they are using the language of trauma, or they may be describing something that just sounds like an awful thing that's happened to them, and you sense that that this must have had a big impact upon them. Um, just to be respectfully interested, um, by
Yeah.
asking, by willing to listen and ask questions.
Yeah. And what, like, I can imagine that's a pretty uncomfortable space to enter into. Um, so how, yeah, what sort of advice would you give someone entering into that space where they're wanting to engage with a friend or a family member, or someone who's been vulnerable with them with their trauma? How do you, as the person trying to engage with that, not shut off or say something you shouldn't? Is it just about asking a question or listening, or what's your perspective?
That's a good question, Caleb, because um, um, I guess um, mm, many of us know enough about trauma to know that kind of revisiting something that has been traumatic to us in our lives can itself be pretty disturbing and troubling. So diving in with loads of detailed questions is not wise. Um,
Mm.
and I suppose a bit of honesty would make sense, which would be to say, oh, thank you for telling me about that. That I'm just, you know, conscious of how awful that must have been. And in many ways, I don't know whether that's something that you want to tell me more about, and I'm nervous about sort of asking questions, but I don't want to be uninterested. What would be helpful?
Mm.
Would it help you to say more? Because I'm willing to listen, but I guess you might not want to. So you just acknowledging your own uncertainty, and expressing your willingness to listen, but giving giving the other person control over how much they would like to say and in what
Yeah,
way.
brilliant. Yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear. And yeah, it's often could be an awkward thing to enter into that space, and you so wanting to help someone, and often the way we help is we end up harming them, because whether it's we're trying to solve an issue which is completely out of our understanding and scope, we're not professionals, or if it's um like you said, just asking too many questions to get into the depth of it, it's just can be really unhelpful. um just
And I think sometimes, Caleb, in a funny kind of way, um, those of us who are Christians, um, kind of can do this particularly poorly. Uh, and and I think part of the reason of that is we kind of feel as though we've got the answer. We've got Jesus,
right.
and we are rightly persuaded that relationship with Christ, the promises of the gospel, is treasure beyond measure,
Mm.
and it's true. But that can lead us to move too quickly
Yeah.
to try and sort of offer this solution.
Right.
Um, and whereas in a funny way, our non-Christian friends um, don't feel as though they've got any answers, so they do what is actually the really helpful thing to do, which is to just to listen
Yeah.
and to sympathise, and
Mm.
to understand. Um, and we kind of we're in danger of sort of bypassing that too fast, because we want to we want to offer the solution, and we
Right.
do it in a way that is too quick, too clumsy, too simplistic, too thin,
Yeah.
because we've not taken the time to properly listen and understand.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And if anyone is like myself, I'd say I'm an optimist at heart. So my advice in these situations is to try and find the light at the end of the tunnel, or to try and find the positive bits, which, from what you're saying, it can be very unhelpful, because you're not sitting in that space with them and just listening. And it is a journey, and you have to walk through it. But yeah, something that I've had to learn is to be able to empathize with someone, and that means to enter into that space, which is particularly difficult, because everything in me is just like, no, I don't want to do this, but it's so helpful, because I know when it's been done to me, that's what I've needed, is just someone to just be there
Mm.
with me and listen. Because that is so empowering in itself. Is just to have a friend, and I think that's the example Jesus sets for us as well. He came to earth, he entered into our pain and entered into our suffering. Um, and that's his heart is to heal, but you have to enter into those spaces to bring healing. Um, so what's your thoughts, or are you able to speak into how trauma does engage in the biblical narrative? Um, how yeah, what's your perspective there?
Um, in all sorts of ways, the Bible describes desperately awful suffering.
Mm,
Um, you think about the pages of the Old Testament, and you don't have to think very, very hard before you're encountering characters who suffer terribly. I think about Joseph. Yeah, and we have a nice sort of spin of his Technicolor Dreamcoat, and it all sounds very shiny. But stop for a moment and think about being betrayed by your brothers, beaten, sold into slavery, arriving in a foreign land where presumably you don't have the language. You've now been moved to a slave. You're falsely accused. You're thrown into prison. You're forgotten for years. I mean, there is huge trauma in Joseph's life. Move to Job, and think about the appalling barrage of suffering that the first few chapters of Job described, or isolated incidents. One of the ones I think about in the book is um, the rape of Tamar by her half brother Amnon. And again, that the Bible is in a sense discreet. It doesn't. It's not graphic in the way that it describes these things. And that's a good lesson for us, I think, particularly when we end up preaching on some of these really um, um, terrible experiences of suffering. But it doesn't shrink away from them either. So there's lots of Old Testament kind of experiences of suffering. The Bible, God knows the terrible things that happen in our world, and he provides examples of men and women of faith engaging with those experiences for us. But then press forward into the New Testament, and of course the central event of the Christian faith, the death of Jesus on the cross, is itself a desperately traumatic event. The crucifixion has been described as possibly the most brutal form of execution that has ever been invented. And so, at the very heart of what Christianity declares is a salvation event that is itself rooted in a traumatic moment. So you'd immediately want to say, well, then Christianity must have something to say on the topic of trauma.
Right.
If the cross at the heart of Christianity involves severe suffering, which is turned into a salvation moment, then we've got to have something to say. Of course, touching on what I was saying earlier, we mustn't be simplistic. We mustn't sort of, kind of bring that gospel message to bear as if it's a quick fix. It's all going to be okay because God promises to make everything better in heaven, or Jesus suffered, so he understands your suffering, so stop worrying about it. There are thin, kind of inadequate ways of bringing that gospel to bear, and we need to find richer, fuller ways of speaking of the arc of the Bible's narrative.
Right. So how do we in then places like a church where you said people are preaching about it, how do you engage with it where you're giving weight to the trauma, but you're not creating an oversimplistic view of how to deal with it, and you're not magnifying that's all you're talking about as well. You're not magnifying the trauma. How do you navigate? Because it seems like quite a tension in that space.
I think there's probably good reason. I mean, if you were tackling some of those most graphic, I mean, I think particularly if you were dealing with a passage that spoke about brutality, there would be some argument to say, it might be worth letting people know the week before or at the beginning of your Sunday gathering, that you're going to be tackling a very difficult passage in Scripture today.
Mm.
And if for whatever reason you don't feel you're in a place where you're going to be able to manage that, don't feel awkward about deciding that you need to step out. I think that would be an appropriate thing,
Mm.
because to suddenly find that you are reading an account of horrible brutality or sexual violence, as a victim of sexual violence yourself, and there'd been no warning, and it just comes completely unawares. The person walks to the front, opens the Bible, and starts reading a passage like that. Um,
Right.
that doesn't feel kind. So to some extent, being alert to the way that the things that we are saying, or the things that we're reading in Scripture, might land on people in our community, people in our gatherings on a Sunday, is just loving. Um,
Yeah.
and then I think the it is reflecting in, for those who are preaching. I think it is reflecting in our preaching the things that we've already been talking about, taking time um, to enter into the experience, to be willing to engage with the experience of people, to point to the hope of the gospel,
Mm.
but to do so in ways that doesn't feel too quick.
Yeah. That's good. And allowing for that space and understanding for who may be present, I think is important. Something else that I'd love to get your thoughts on, is how we as Christians engage with like interventions with trauma. So like on a practical side, if we hear about someone, a friend or someone in the community, as a pastor, if there's someone coming into the church community and you become aware of their trauma, what's what's some helpful interventions that I think churches have. The reason I'm wanting to ask, I'll get to the question. I feel like I've got a number of questions going through my mind, but I feel like churches haven't dealt with trauma very well, or mental health very well, because they're either afraid of professional help, or they're afraid of different interventions because there's a lack of understanding. And going back to what you said before, it's like an oversimplification of Jesus will just heal you. So we'll pray, and that should be fine. And I'm not saying prayer isn't important, because I think it's very important in the whole journey. But then when you're dealing with an issue as complicated as trauma, surely there's means of acknowledging like there may need to be particular interventions, and yeah, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I mean, it overlaps with the thinking that Helen Thorne and I did in the book we wrote about mental health in your church, um, which is kind of say, our approach wants to be that on the one hand we don't imagine that church can do everything,
Right.
um, that we have all the resources and nothing else is needed. But on the other hand, nor do we want to think that church can do nothing.
Mm.
And I think different at different times, different churches can fall into either of those errors. Um, either we take hands off and say this isn't our business. We're not going to engage, or we kind of think because we got the gospel, we can do everything.
Mm.
And I think wisdom says, um, people who have committed their lives to thinking carefully about the impact of mental health struggles, or the impact of trauma, bring a level of expertise and experience that very few in our churches will have.
Right.
And so we want to be grateful for that, and recognize that people will will be wanting to engage, and probably will have engaged already before we hear anything about it. Um, but on the other hand, to say how can that kind of mental health professional input um, be um, be kind of augmented or supplemented, or in some sense considered in the light of our gospel understanding and a Christian faith, so that we bring the things that they're being the ways in which they're being helped in a secular setting, and we want to hear about that, but we also want um, to to bring it alongside our conviction that God is over all these things.
Yeah.
He is able to meet us in all of our struggles in a more comprehensive and more wonderful way than anyone or anything ever else can.
Mhm. Brilliant. So sort of finding a balance of, yeah, how appropriate is it to, as a church community, engage with an individual from a helping level and intervening level, and how appropriate is it to engage with professionals. Um, I think, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Is like, I think it's important, like church is the vehicle that God uses. We see that in the New Testament to bring his healing and his hope. And it's essentially a place of broken people. And my understanding, like you said, is there are people that have done extensive thinking and research in these spaces to discover the path to healing. So it's unwise not to engage with that, but then at the same time, as a community, that's what we, as a church body, it's like you are a community. So when one person of the body is hurting, you experience that hurt, and as a community, you want to support however you can. And I think that's the important part as well, for churches to be present in people's suffering, so that they know that they're not isolated, even when they're seeking help, that they have a strong support network, that they're not going through something alone. So
And and
I
and
like what you're
and the,
saying.
and the simple, the simple thing of asking somebody what would be helpful. Somebody whose level of trauma, which may or may not have been associated with church in the past, um, but which is making being in a church gathering with lots of people around a really stressful experience.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of heroic effort on their part to try and keep coming
Yeah.
on a Sunday, simply to say what would help, what would make this easier for you. Is there anything that we could do? Um, and that alone says, we want to love you and we want to
Mm.
care for you. Explain what we could be doing that is more useful for you,
Yeah.
um, rather than um, sort of making assumptions or laying out a whole host of things that you're going to do without having listened first, which
Brilliant.
again actually generates more helplessness. We're taking control of the situation, and that's a scarier thing for
Yeah.
somebody who's experienced trauma.
Yeah. Is that the goal of walking with someone going through trauma from your side as a professional? Is the idea to help bring them to a place of control, that they can see um that they're not controlled by this thing?
Um, uh, Sorry, another lag on the line, unfortunately. Um, um,
I can
is
ask
it to bring them to a place of control? Was
yeah,
that the question?
con- yeah, to bring them to a place of control over their trauma, as opposed to feeling, because obviously from what I'm gathering is trauma sort of tornadoes, everything that you're experiencing that you feel like your life's out of control, or it's just something that's happening to you that you don't know how to journey through or get through. So it's a sense of like this lack of control that you have over your life or over your emotions or your thoughts or your body. So is the idea to help a person get back to a place of control?
Um, Sort of. I mean, the helplessness is one of the features of that is often identified in the in the traumatic experience that a person has had, the event that's happened to them, or the series of events. Um, and then you have kind of the aftermath, as it were, the ongoing effects. And if um, uh, in that aftermath, going on feeling as if a person has no really control over what is being done to them by others is certainly something to be avoided.
Mm.
Um, I guess I'd probably want to go a little bit further than that and say it's not only about giving them a sense of control; it's about giving them a sense of a refuge, um, of a love and acceptance, um, which they ultimately find in Christ,
Mm.
our rock, our refuge, our strong tower. Um, but again, to get to that point via, we've not really spoken about lament, and it's probably worth making
Yeah.
sure that we have, that we include that, um, that to to be with others who are able to join you in lamenting for something really difficult and hard, that has happened to you.
Mm.
The psalmists present us with so many um, examples
Mm.
of bringing sadness, bewilderment to God
Yeah.
in the lament psalms.
Yeah, I think like 70% or over 70% of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's something we don't practice in our culture. I mean, it's something so foreign, this idea of lament, because we want everything to look good, to feel good. So we do over medicate and we do oversimplify things because that's just the easy way.
Yep.
Um, so how do we engage in lament?
Um, I think at a very practical level, one of the first things we could do is buy Mark Vrogop's excellent book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. I think he's done more than anyone to kind of popularize, is that the right word? To make Christians aware
Yeah.
of lament as a part of our devotional life, as our way of engaging with Christ, and it's such an excellent book. So we can be hugely helped by that. Um, Speaking sort of more practically, I think I found myself thinking a lot over the last couple of years about kind of corporate lament,
Okay.
what it would look like, either as a whole church community together, or maybe in our small group, with a few other trusted people, um, to engage in lament,
Mm.
to read one of the lament psalms, to spend some time reflecting on it together, and praying together, particularly if in your small group you knew that there was somebody who was suffering
Yeah.
in a particular way, and struggling with something very hard, either from the past or in the current moment, and to come alongside them to share um, the hurt, and the bewilderment, and the crying out to God for some
Mm.
sense of meaning in the midst of things that are bewildering them. Um,
Yeah.
and doing that with others. I mean, we all know this. Suffering isolates you. You
Mm.
feel you feel alone in your suffering. And so to find others being willing to join you in expressing the sadness and the puzzle of what's going on um, can be a very precious thing.
Yeah. And so from a psychological perspective, or I'm curious, have you found the impact that lament has on your brain or your body, or like obviously it's a biblical practice, but then when you're saying it does something to those experiencing trauma, what does it do to you?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. Maybe there have been some scientific studies looking at the impact of lament on us at a neurophysiological level. I'm not aware of any. And I think one of my reflections on how we make sense of um, the neurobiology of many of our experiences is trying to work out chicken and egg. Is what's going on in my brain
Mm.
um, the cause of my experiences, or is this an expression of my experiences? I think that's a sort of philosophically kind of a bit of an important but a not very straightforward question to answer. Um,
Right.
I, I think how does lament help us? I think I think it is that connection with others, and the difference it makes is taking something about which we are being silent, um, both with one another
Mm.
because we don't know what to say. Um, one of the um, one of the classic books about trauma um, begins by saying trauma is unspeakable.
Mm.
It's unspeakably awful. We use those kind of phrases, and one of the results is that people don't have words. They don't know how to speak about the terrible things that have happened to them.
Mm.
And it seems to me that one of the things that's being achieved um, when we seek to lament before the Lord is that we are finding words, and even better,
Mm.
we're finding words that He has provided for us to speak of these things.
Yeah, brilliant. And just sort of some closing thoughts. If there's something, or what's something that you think, with regards to the work you've done in your book, Understanding Trauma, what would be a key thing that you'd hope people take away from reading that?
Um, I think to to feel a greater confidence in no, let me put it a different way. I think to have an ambition as a church community um, to say that we want to engage more richly, more fully
Mm.
with those who've experienced severe suffering.
Yeah.
Um, you kind of think, of course, we want to do that. If there are people in our community or people entering into our community for whom some of the worst forms of suffering have been part of their experience, then in imitation of Christ, we want to love them as well as we possibly can. And my suspicion um, is that we probably, for all sorts of reasons, and that would include being slightly scared off by things that we don't understand
Mm.
about trauma. Um, we don't do that well.
Yeah.
So I think a determination to say we want our church to be better and better year on year at loving people who have faced some of the worst things.
Mm. Brilliant. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having this conversation. Um, if people are wanting to find out more about your work or grab a copy of your book, Understanding Trauma, where would you send them to, Steve?
Um, well, the work of, as you would imagine, BCUK, Biblical Counselling UK. Find your way to our website, bcuk.org, and you'll find lots about what goes on in our ministry. The Understanding Trauma is coming out in March 2025, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, and it's published by the Good Book Company. But you could find it on Amazon and other places as well.
Awesome. I'll throw links up to those two things there as well. And yeah, I think something that I've really found helpful in this whole conversation is just creating a space to listen and to be present with those suffering and those experiencing trauma. And like you said, not being isolated from that, because even in our withdrawal, we're withdrawing from someone who is themselves in a very isolated spot. So yeah, I think that's something that we can take and think about, is how we can enter into these spaces, which are difficult spaces, but I'm so thankful that the Bible has given us tools like Lament, these practices where we can engage as believers with each other and find healing and hope in Jesus Christ. So,
And Caleb, to learn. I mean, I think people who have faced terrible events in their lives and are persevering in their relationship with Christ have masses to teach us.
yeah.
There's lots for us to learn from people who've walked some of these hardest paths and are continuing in faith despite that. And so to be humble in listening and understanding and learning.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, that's so true. Is to be able to learn, you have to ask a question, and you have to listen, and you have to show up. So that's a great one. Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. Really enjoyed the conversation, and hope to chat to you again sometime soon.
Thanks very much, Caleb. Thanks for having me.